Aqui do ITS. Nós temos hoje uma live muito especial nessa terça-feira, inclusive dia dos professores, né? Meu abraço para todos os professores do Brasil aí que estejam nos assistindo. Nós temos uma live muito legal na companhia do Facebook. O Facebook está permitindo que nós tenhamos aqui a presença de pessoas muito especiais para falar sobre portabilidade de dados e sobre privacidade. Vocês sabem que esse é um assunto super relevante, GDPR e LGPD tratam de portabilidade, e é um assunto que tem mesmo que começar a ser discutido porque gera efeitos muito práticos na proteção dos dados pessoais. Então, para falar sobre isso, estou aqui do meu lado, Rebeca Garcia, que é Public Policy Manager do Facebook no Brasil e que está nos visitando aqui no ITS para permitir que nós tenhamos a live de hoje. Rebeca, muito obrigado por vir aqui.
Obrigada, Sérgio. Obrigada. Eu gostaria de agradecer o convite e a oportunidade de estar aqui hoje com o ITS e com o Bijan, meu colega, para falar desse tema tão desafiador e tão atual. Eu vou começar falando em português, mas vou passar para o Bijan em inglês para a gente tratar desse tema. Eu queria primeiro me apresentar, né? Eu sou gerente de políticas públicas do Facebook no Brasil e estou aqui acompanhada do Bijan, que é gerente de políticas públicas e privacidade do Facebook. Ele fica baseado em Washington, D.C. E vai falar um pouquinho aqui hoje sobre portabilidade de dados e privacidade, que é um tema que o Facebook explorou num white paper recente, publicado agora em setembro. E o Bijan está no Brasil essa semana para realmente ter esse tipo de diálogo. Esse foi um dos principais objetivos pelos quais o Facebook publicou esse white paper, que é ter esse tipo de diálogo como a gente está tendo aqui hoje no Rio, no Brasil, como a gente vai ter amanhã em Brasília, mas também no mundo inteiro. Bom, sem mais eu passo para o Bijan. Bijan, it's a pleasure to have you here at ITS, to have you here in Brazil, and to take this opportunity to explore the white paper on data portability and privacy, and also considering that we are in Brazil in this very context of like having this new data protection law, which provides for a data portability right. So the floor is yours, and thank you.
Thank you
very much.
I'm glad to be here. Again, my name is Bijan Madhani. I'm a privacy and public policy manager at Facebook, where I focus on innovative policies and procedures around data protection law or data protection law and practices within Facebook for our products and for external policy making. And so I'm here at a pretty auspicious time, as Rebecca was saying. There's a new data protection law coming into effect soon in Brazil. There's a right to data portability in that law, and that's something that we at Facebook have been thinking quite a bit about. Not just in the context of the Brazilian law, but of course in a global context. The right to portability is something that Facebook believes it's something that should be guaranteed around the world, something that Mark Zuckerberg, our CEO, has been a strong advocate for over the last year, and that I think we're trying to be very thoughtful about, trying to be very collaborative about in trying to implement the right to data portability around the world, the EU, in California, in Brazil, and elsewhere as it becomes a global norm. So what do we mean, what does Facebook mean when we say the right to data portability? I think first and foremost we mean when you give your data to one service, for example Facebook, you should be able to port that data from Facebook to another service of your choosing. Why is this important? Well, one, this is important to us because it's the law. We have to comply with GDPR. We will soon have to comply with the CCPA in California, and we'll have to comply with the law here as well. And to do that, we intend to enable users to port their information to other services. But it's also important for a variety of other reasons. Facebook cares about a dynamic, diverse, vibrant ecosystem online in digital services. And we also care a great deal about, especially on my team, the data protection, the privacy team, enabling users to have control and choice over their data. And so the right to data portability is sort of the culmination of that ideal, the right to control and move your data to another service or to move it away from one service altogether. We think that from the ecosystem perspective, that'll enable users to choose services that are more innovative, that are dynamic, and will also enable new entrants to the market to offer features that are perhaps competitive or innovative relative to existing players in a particular digital service market. And so we think, the principle is good for 3 reasons, right? User control and autonomy, user choice and control, and then innovation. These are important things to us as a company, and that's why we support the right to data portability. This is not a new right to us either. It is new in the sense that it's appearing in laws very recently. GDPR was really the first extant example of the law of the right to data portability in practice. Facebook has offered tools on portability, enabling users to take their data from one service to another, or to take it away from a service for almost 10 years. So in 2010, we began offering our Download Your Information tool, which essentially allows you to go into your settings and access and then download all of the information that you have provided to Facebook in a machine-readable format. We updated that in 2018 in the run-up to GDPR. It's now available in 2 formats, HTML and JSON, one of which is more human-readable, the other one is machine-readable and parsable by other services if you choose to upload your data to those services. We've also for a long time offered Facebook login as part of our Facebook consumer app platform. And that's a service in which users are able to enable third-party applications to access their name, their profile information, profile picture, some additional information, their email address, for example, to enable them to start using a new service very quickly. So rather than filling out your name and your email address and your a whole host of profile information, the Facebook login tool enables you essentially port your identity in a small way to a new service. And so we're familiar with the idea of enabling data to move at the user direction from Facebook or some service to another. But we'd like to sort of move into the next generation of portability, where, if you think about it, the Download Your Information tool is useful for users in particular who are interested in backing up their information. It provides all of your data that you choose to put in the archive in a sizable machine-readable format or in a human-readable format that you can use to sort of peruse. But generally speaking, it's cumbersome to then download that information and upload it to a new service. If our interest is in ensuring that ecosystems are dynamic and users have seamless control, DYI is sort of the first generation of the tool. We're interested, and I think a lot of other companies in the ecosystem are interested in moving to the next generation, which would enable direct transfer of information on a service that you provide to another service in a sort of machine-readable but automated and seamless manner. That's why we're part of the Data Transfer Project, which is a open source consortium that was started by Google, but includes Facebook, Microsoft, Twitter, and very recently Apple. And the idea behind the Data Transfer Project is to enable not just those companies, but a whole host of companies, small, medium, and large, to operate around a sort of common set of principles and a common data model through which they can port data. So let me give you an example of that. So Facebook stores data in its servers in a particular way. We have a data structure that talks about photos, and generally speaking, photos are a pretty commonly used format, JPEG, PNG, GIF, across the internet. But a lot of the information around the metadata, the way it's stored, how individuals are tagged in photos, is sort of Facebook specific in the data model. But users are interested in porting their photos or other information from Facebook to another service. So the Data Transfer Project essentially is a translation project. It enables users to port their information from Facebook to Google to Flickr or a smaller service using existing APIs, and just creates an open source method of translation between those APIs, so that there's a common way for all the companies to talk about photos or posts or playlists between those companies. And then once it's translated into this common format, then Spotify or Google on the far end can then translate that common data model back into their own proprietary data model, so that the data can be ported across without the user having to touch it at all. But of course, the ability to port information from one service to another in an automated, seamless way is not without its challenges. We recently put out this white paper in September around data portability and privacy to explore some of the challenges and the key questions we've encountered in building tools like the Data Transfer Project that enable direct transfer, direct portability between services. And the questions really do get quite fundamental. First one, what is data portability? That's pretty basic. You just heard me say, well, the data portability is the right for you to take your information from one service to another. Within that, there's quite a bit of, I think, gray area and room for interpretation. In the white paper, we identify a few different potential models for what could be considered data portability, and we lay those out on a spectrum. A way to describe this is basically that technically all transfers between one service to another happens in a very similar way. Data is taken from one data structure, passed through an API, and then moved across the web in a secure way, and then arrives at another API, is ingested by another service, and is turned into their data structure. At a technical level, all of that looks the same. But of course, there are a whole host of different ways in which those technical rails might be implemented. The right to data portability is one. Consumer apps, your traditional app ecosystem is another. If you think about it, your Apple device takes information that's stored on your phone, your contacts, your photos, and enables apps through APIs to access that information and put it onto their servers where they can process it and perform, provide you with new services. Of course, that's happening with your permission. That seems a lot like the right to data portability. It's your information going from one place to another over an API in a direct way to a new service that can provide you with additional features or services or some benefit or another. But we think that it might be different in some way to the right to data portability as construed in GDPR or the LGPD or CCPA. And we want to explore that a little bit. So we do that in the white paper. We set out a spectrum that says, there's probably some additional factor, perhaps the relationship between the entities that are involved in the transfer that aren't the user. So if, for example, if Apple has a relationship with the app developer, the developer or iOS terms say what the developer can do or not do with the data, how they can process it, what they have to do when they leave the app store, whether they can transfer the data onward, that might be inconsistent with what the right to portability actually is. Which in most constructs is an unencumbered right of the user to take their data from one place to another without really a whole host of restrictions that come from a pre-existing relationship between services. And so we have a spectrum. We talk about open transfers, conditioned transfers, and partnership transfers. Partnership transfers are the app ecosystem model you'd think about. Facebook has an app ecosystem as well. You might recall Farmville was a very popular app a few years ago. I hope it's not popular anymore. Then there's open transfers. Those are the ones like download your information, where there are no conditions applied to your ability to take your data from the service and move it somewhere else. You just get the archive and you can do what you want with it. We think the next generation of portability tools is probably going to end up somewhere in the middle, in this conditioned transfer space, where participants in the ecosystem, the controllers, have to ensure that they're protecting the data appropriately when it's in transit and at rest, that they are securing the transfer using the best technical measures, and that they're appropriately disclosing information to users. But we don't know, what those disclosures should look like, what the appropriate data protection requirements are, because it turns out that the right to data portability has sort of almost two faces. It can mean multiple things to different people. For example, the data protection community often thinks of it as a right for users to control their information, to have the ability to take it from one service to another, but in a way that is secure and protected. And so the information that you might provide as a condition for enabling that transfer would be perhaps more detailed, would require some verification of a third party, would involve additional auditing and oversight and vetting of the ecosystem to which you enable transfers. It looks a lot more potentially like the partnerships model, in which the uses that are permitted at the far end of the transfer, at the recipient end, are perhaps more limited in order to protect the data subject when the data is transferred to the third party. On the other hand, competition authorities in particular think of data portability as a means to enable consumer choice, enable switching between services, and they think of a much more fluid marketplace and a much more fluid ability to take your data from one service to another. Any information provided would be potentially minimal in that context. You don't want to chill the ecosystem of enabling users to take their information from one place to another, because that would provide potentially a barrier in the place where, in a right where the barriers to entry are supposed to be lowered, where they're supposed to be promoting the idea of switching. So as little friction as possible would be ideal in the sort of pro-competition, the pro-innovation context. Of course, these things are at odds, right? The more information you provide users, the better they are to protect themselves, the better they are able to inform themselves about the recipients of their information. Of course, that means that they're less likely to transfer their information to new entrants to marketplaces that don't have, a good history of data protection or a long history of data protection. And so we think where you come down on that spectrum will help you decide how to design your next generation of portability tools. And that'll help us and the other members of the data transfer project, for example, decide how we're going to architect our tools as well. So that's question one. That's sort of the baseline. Where do you come from on data portability, and what are your expectations with respect to how the transfer should be performed at a very high level? Question two, a little less fundamental, but perhaps more essential to actually practically implementing data portability. What data should be included? This is the scope question. There are actually two scope questions. What data and whose data should be included? I'll start with what data, because this again goes to the sort of question of whether you're interested in data portability for competition reasons or interested in data portability for user control and user choice reasons. So the right to data portability, in almost every way it's written, says you have the right to port your information that you provide to a service. That's pretty simple to understand initially. You have the right to port your photos that you upload to Facebook. You have the right to port the posts that you type into the Facebook, post box. You have the right to port, the information about the pages that you like. I like, the Los Angeles Lakers. I like Real Madrid. That information can be then ported to a new service. That seems pretty cut and dry. But what about other information? So necessarily, as you interact with the service, Facebook, Google, literally anybody, they collect information about how you use the service. Observed information. So some of that is pretty fundamental. When you're typing in a search box, we collect information, the information you type, and then the results that are generated. That's observed information about you. If you use a Fitbit, the Fitbit collects your heart rate. It collects the number of steps you take over the course of the day. That's again observed information. And in the interest of helping users control and choose which services they use, it makes sense for some observed information to move along with them. The guidance pursuant to the GDPR put together by the Article 29 Working Party in the EU talks about all observed information should go. Of course, that's guidance, and there's some disagreement even in the European Commission with that guidance, because it seems inconsistent with the interests of companies to innovate and compete, to have all observed information to go. For example, we use observed information to track whether users are engaging in click fraud. So we sell ads on Facebook, and you see the ads, and we want the ads to be delivered in an accurate way, so that people can see the things that are most interesting to them. If there are a whole host of automated services clicking through and taking advantage of the way that ads are delivered, it might skew the ad delivery and targeting system in a way that's not appropriate for our user experience. So we collect information about how often people are clicking and refreshing pages to make sure that we know, that you're not an automated user, you're actually a human on Facebook. That information probably not super useful if you're switching from Facebook for your photos to Google, because it doesn't tell you anything about how it doesn't help enable your use of the new service. But it does tell us a lot of information about how to protect our users on the service and to enable that to prevent click fraud. The same thing is true for how often you refresh a page or how long you view a video. All this is information that's useful for us in fine-tuning our algorithms and enabling us to deliver ads and content in the newsfeed in a way that is most consistent with the experience that our users expect on Facebook, but isn't really ideal for the new user at a new service, right? The new service should provide that user with information pursuant to their actions on the new service. And so there's probably a line that needs to be drawn in what observed information needs to be transferred. Oftentimes observed information is deleted pretty quickly. Should we keep observed information for the interest of portability, even though it's likely to be deleted? That seems to be infringing on the rights of individuals who expect that information to be deleted in the first place. But of course, if you're interested in facilitating innovation and competition, if you're a competition regulator, for example, you might say, actually, we'd like to have some of that observed information about how ads are targeted and delivered go over to the new provider so they can also better target and deliver ads and make revenue at far end with respect to that user as well. And so, depending on where you land on the spectrum, you might have a different perspective on whether provided or observed information should go. Inferred information is a third sort of category in this which data bucket, or which data question. Inferred information is information that is derived from provided or observed information through proprietary means. Either proprietary or algorithmic means. The best example of this is if you go to Facebook and you look in your settings, you can see in which ad interests we categorize you. That's inferred based off of the pages you like, your actions on Facebook, and it enables us to enable our advertisers to target you with ads based on your interests. That's information that's available in our access tool, but it's not required to be ported, at least under the current construction of GDPR's right to portability, because that information is of almost no use to the recipient in providing you with services. And so it's not included in the right to portability, and it could often include proprietary or trade secret or information that's useful for competitive purposes or incentivizes companies to innovate that isn't necessary for the new service. But again, if you're interested in promoting competition and innovation, it might be nice to enable the ad interest categories to go over to the new service, so again, they can better advertise and target ads to you. And so that's the which data. Where you land on the sort of vertical axis of provided, observed, inferred information depends on what your interest is in portability. Is it in competition, innovation, or is it in consumer control and choice and enabling them to have the best experience in the next service? The next question in the white paper, whose data should be ported, is probably the most important to Facebook, and probably for a lot of online services. We're a social network. Everything that happens on Facebook happens usually with somebody else involved, right? The purpose of Facebook is to enable you to connect with your friends. You have conversations with your friends, you post photos that include your friends, you post statuses and you tag your friends and you complain about them. Everything that happens on Facebook happens with friends. And that means that portability necessarily involves friends as well. The cleanest example of this, and it can get much more complicated, is a photo. So you upload a photo to Facebook. Rebecca and I went to a party together. I tag her in the photo. And so now Facebook knows that Rebecca and I, who are friends, were in this photo together. Now I decide that I want to use Google Photos or Dropbox as my photo storage site of choice. So I say to Facebook, I want to port my photos from Facebook to Google Photos through your data transfer project protocol. Does Rebecca have any interest in that photo that I'm porting? I think she might say yes, especially if the photo is one in which I've made a silly face or something like that. She doesn't want that on the internet, or elsewhere on the internet, for example. So how can we ensure that Rebecca's interest in the photo, her image is there, she's doing something, are accounted for in the process of porting that information? Or does she have an interest in that at all? The most guidance on this, so competition authorities have written about it a little bit, because the social graph is essentially the connections between friends on social networks is very important from a competition perspective. At least advocates say so, for enabling innovation and competition in the social media ecosystem. So they say, well, of course, you should port that information. The fact that you guys are friends is useful so that when a new service can advertise to Rebecca or ask her to come join the new service to better ensure that I stay around that new service. It sort of reduces again the barriers to entry with respect to network effects. But on the other hand, Rebecca has a data protection interest in that photo. What should we provide some mechanism for her to vindicate her rights? any mechanism that we provide, just like any friction we provide in the context of telling the user about a new service, necessarily introduces friction and potentially would prevent me from porting some information, not all my photos, but some photos from a new service. And that's just with me and Rebecca. Rebecca, it turns out I have a ton of friends who are tagged in a whole host of my photos. One photo might have 5 people, another photo might just have 2 people, but all of them have an interest in those photos. Should there be some mechanism through which all of them can vindicate their rights in those photos, at least have some information about where those photos are going, so they can say at the far end, maybe delete the tag of me in that photo, or delete the image because I didn't consent to it being transferred. There must be some mechanism, potentially, or there should be some mechanism, we think, to enable those other users to vindicate their rights in the transfer. Again, competition folks might say, you can probably port it, and the recipient service then needs to contact them and request consent from them. The idea is to enable the transfer of the social graph in the first instance, and then allow for vindication of rights after the fact. Whereas a data protection-minded person might say no, vindication of rights before porting data. So that's the who's question. So we've gone through what is data portability, which data should be ported, and whose data should be ported. Now the last 2 questions fall into another bucket, which is what we like to call sort of responsibility and accountability. The first bucket is, how do you protect privacy in the context of making those transfers? So yes, you should have the baseline, security and data protection provisions that everybody in industry ought to have. Encrypt the transfer in transit, encrypt the data at rest if it's not being used. Ensure that users have information about the service that it's going to, but again, how much information we don't know. But there are also, additional factors that you could introduce depending on how much data protection you want to have in the system. So with respect to, for example, the requesting user, how much information do you provide to them about the recipient service? We talked about this a little bit before. Do you disclose the name of the recipient service and their website and call it a day? Or do you say, no, here are their data protection practices, here are their terms of use, here's what they say about how they're going to use and collect that information, and then from there enable the user to make an informed decision about the portability they're about to undertake. And that's where you are from a data protection mindset. You want to provide the user with as much useful information about the recipient service as possible. But again, if you're innovation or competition minded, you might say, well, the user can find out about that new service on the far end, or they should figure that out on their own. We want to enable as much portability as possible. We don't want to introduce friction, and we want to make sure that the ecosystem of services that can receive this information is as deep and broad, and as broad as possible. So then you might just provide like a link to the website for the new service. You might say the name, and you might, that might be enough. And then you might let users port to as many services they want, rather than a limited ecosystem of vetted and clearly data protective recipients. The second part of that the second subpart of that question is, all right, how do you enable privacy protection with respect to friends or connections on a service? So, do you provide them a mechanism to consent to a transfer of information that might include their data protection rights? So, if I want to port my friends list over, should Rebecca be able to say, well, no, I don't want my contact information to go over to this new service? That information is incredibly valuable for the purpose of, building up a new service and helping that new service get new users, but it's potentially problematic from the perspective of, well, Rebecca doesn't really trust that new service, even if I do. Or maybe there's a way that we can provide Rebecca with some information about that new service. Again, what information do we provide? Do we provide information about their data protection and collection practices? Do we provide a history of their regulatory interventions? It turns out that the FTC or the Irish Data Protection Commissioner has investigated them a bunch of times. That's not going to make it as likely for Rebecca to allow her contact information to go over to that new service. And as a result, that new service is probably going to be less likely to acquire and retain new users. So where, again, you fall on the spectrum of information provided and controls provided to Rebecca depends on how interested you are in the data protection or competition aspects of portability. And the last bucket is, how do you ensure that these third parties, the recipients of the information, Google Drive or whomever, any small or medium-sized entrant to a market, are doing the right thing? They're protecting their data appropriately. They are disclosing information about the practices appropriately to users. They're not, transferring information to third parties in a way that's inconsistent with the expectations of users. One thing to do is to say do nothing. It's not on the transferring party, the transferring controller, to do anything with respect to the recipient. Again, a pro-innovation or competition-minded person might say, yeah, of course, the user has to be informed about the practices, but they can get that information from the service that receives the data once they choose to port it. On the other hand, we have been told very recently, for example, in our consent order with the FTC, that we have a whole host of obligations with respect to third parties that receive information from Facebook, user information from Facebook, even if that transfer is user-directed. The FTC says that we have to conduct a proactive initial review of the practices and the uses of data that the app developer is likely to engage in. We have to, after the fact, do a bit of random auditing and vetting of the ecosystem. We have to oversee the ecosystem through technical measures, ensure that people are using APIs and collecting the information in a way that's technically expected. There's a whole host of onerous requirements that we are happy to comply with pursuant to the FTC order that potentially a startup in the data portability ecosystem would probably not be as interested in complying with, right? It's a significant investment to review every partner we transfer data to. It's a significant investment to then, after the fact, ensure that the participants in the ecosystem are behaving appropriately. So, again, what level of oversight and vetting and control over the ecosystem are authorities interested in data portability expecting? We think there's probably some middle ground. We think that it's not just going to be, users should port their data willy-nilly, and it's not going to be that all participants in a portability ecosystem have to be overseen and vetted by Facebook and by Google and by all of the traditional platforms in an ecosystem. We think it's most likely going to be that there's going to be some mechanism through which third parties can certify that they are compliant with LGBT, or certify that they're compliant with the GDPR or generalized data protection principles, and then we can say, okay, if these parties have certified this, they're okay as recipients, and then we can provide that certification in the notice we provide to users ahead of a portability request. Or it could be through a code of conduct that cuts across all sort of data protection regimes. We know now through GDPR and LGBT and CCPA what the baseline expectation is for how you protect and secure information on services. And so, you can create a code of conduct. You can envision a code of conduct that cuts across all of these ecosystems, all of these jurisdictions. I think a code of conduct is Article 43 in GDPR. In the U.S., it would happen through sort of an FTC blessing, basically. But you could take the code of conduct and have an independent body vet companies, vet small, medium, large companies against their compliance with that code of conduct, and then say, here you go, thumbs up, you were compliant with that code of conduct. And anybody who's compliant with that code of conduct can freely receive data through portability mechanisms in an ecosystem. And so it's sort of the certification and code of conduct schemes limit the number of entities involved, but not in a way that basically requires that platforms are doing inspection, which is a very high costly burden. And so we think that's probably the best way to strike the balance in between competition interests, data protection interests, open and partnership transfers in a sort of conditioned way. But again, there is no code of conduct yet. There is no certification scheme with respect to portability in any jurisdiction. And so, again, what principles are in the code of conduct, what requirements are in the certification scheme for practices, that all has yet to be laid out. And so we're engaging in this conversation around the white paper to basically, do more than just posit a few potential answers as we do in the white paper, but actually come to some solutions that enable the portability ecosystem to work, to enable the right to portability to be something meaningful to users, to enable them to have choice and control, and to promote innovation and diversity and dynamics in the digital ecosystem. And so, conversations like this here in Brazil, I'm going to be, I was just in Europe having a few conversations in London, and members of our team in Facebook are around the world basically trying to get as much feedback on these questions as possible, so that when we start deploying the next generation of products, we know what information to provide to users, what control mechanisms to provide to friends, and how much oversight and vetting to do of the ecosystem and portability to enable, privacy-protected data portability. Thank you.
Bijan, thank you very much for explaining the white paper for us and for sharing more about the data transfer project. And we have some questions for you, which will be addressed by Professor Caitlin. Then people at home will also have the opportunity to ask some questions for you. So let me talk in Portuguese now.
Sure, go ahead.
Pessoal, eu sou Priscilla Silva, pesquisadora aqui do ITS, não tive a oportunidade de me apresentar e apareci agora no lugar do Sérgio, mas eu vou estar de olho agora nas perguntas que vocês tiverem, podem colocar à vontade nos comentários, com a ajuda do pessoal aqui do ITS. Eu vou estar de olho, vou traduzir as perguntas também. A gente vai passar para as perguntas aqui do grupo da mesa, com a professora Caitlin da PUC-Rio, que vai fazer as perguntas, e depois a gente vai atender as perguntas do público. Por favor, professora Caitlin, seja bem-vinda.
Obrigada Priscila, obrigada Sérgio, obrigada Rebeca. Thank you very much, Bijan, for the opportunity. I have a lot of questions and I hope to get some few answers maybe.
Sure. As best as I can provide.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for your explanation about data portability. I think it's the white paper, the Facebook white paper is helping us researchers to know about what's happening in the market and to address some issues that we have to because of the, how you call it, the spectrum. At one side you have the competition law and all things that have to be regulated by the market or by law. And on the other side we have privacy issues that of course are very important and that are addressed by the GDPR and our data protection general law here in Brazil. So the first question I would like to ask you is about data portability. If data portability will depend on interoperability of systems used by different service providers. Do you think that this is a necessity? Do you consider that if it is a necessity, the products that are developed by different kinds of providers have to take that in account, and the means that every product that is developed and put into the market by different providers have to have the same kind of systems applied to them so that the portability is effective?
So I think you're right. I think, and this is actually in the text of GDPR, which requires a degree of interoperable compatibility between services. But the degree to which they have to be interoperable and compatible, and the means through which you can do it, varies, and there's a great deal of flexibility in how to put this into practice. So one way to do it is to say, well, no, you need to have APIs that are consistent on either side. You need to talk about a particular data type in the exact same way. Your data structure should be identical, and as a result, it'll be really seamless to transfer the data from one service to another, but it will be potentially, detrimental from an innovation perspective. Every time you update your data structure and the way in which you're using the data on the far end in your service, means that you have to update the interoperable standard, and you can't do that without breaking portability between the two services, and then as a result, you're non-compliant with your portability obligations. There's another way to do it, which is kind of the way we've described in the data transfer project, which is there's sort of baseline common ways that every service talks about particular data types. Photos are talked about in a particular way. Metadata is there's a consistent standard EXIF in a way to talk about the information about your photos, and there's also a consistent way to describe the photos themselves. Now, of course, on top of that, companies have layered additional proprietary features. Facebook has tagging. Google categorizes images based off of what's in them. They do some image recognition on top that's stored with the image. Perhaps that information won't be made portable through a common standard like through the data transfer project, but the baseline information how to describe the photo and how to describe the metadata around the photo is sort of common between the services. And so, essentially the data transfer project attempts to provide the best of both worlds, which is there is some interoperability. It translates the data structure from one API to another through adapters and a common data model, but it doesn't freeze the services to that interoperable standard. You can do above and beyond what the baseline is. So everyone talks about photos in the same way, but Facebook can provide tagging, and Google can provide image recognition, and everyone can do additional things on top of that to enable, Snapchat can do filters. Everyone can do additional things on top of the baseline description of how images are described in a digital system beyond the common data model as well.
Great. The other question I have to use something about the fundamental, if you think it is fundamental for a provider to inform privacy and data security policies for other providers to which the data subject intends to transfer their data. Is this something that is this a way to avoid liability?
Something every company wants to know. But this is exactly the question that we were thinking about in the white paper. It doesn't seem that there is much in the way of actual I think some information ought to be provided to the data subject who is requesting the transfer. But in the context of portability, the data subject is truly the controller, and the entity that's performing the action of porting that data from one place to another is acting as a processor, right? And so, in a sense, a lot of the obligation to learn about the new service is on the recipient, is on the data subject, the transferor. And of course, in that instance, perhaps liability as it's moving from the controller is moving data from one place to a new controller. It holds the liability as well, controller, right, not the processor. Of course, there are models of data portability that involve controllership and a whole host of complications, which of course puts some obligation on entities like Facebook to provide some information, we think, about the recipient controller. How much information? That's why we wrote the white paper. We're not exactly sure. We think, probably they intend, here's their privacy policy, they intend to use their information in this way. Or if there's a certification scheme, hey, they've complied with the certification scheme, they are, data portability A++. Feel confident making that transfer. But too much information, hey, they have a whole history of data protection violations and investigations by X data protection authority, could chill transfers, and we don't know that that's on us or on the third-party provider to make available to the user. And so we think that yes, it's clear that we should provide some information, but how much is unclear. I think there's room for additional guidance and regulation on that, no matter the jurisdiction. It's clear that it's unclear actually from the guidance of the GDPR context that how much you should provide, and since that's the only really extant guidance out there, we think it would be helpful to have more as well.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I agree with you. So Priscilla, can I make another question?
Yes.
Is it possible? Okay, so thinking about what you were saying about the photographs, you and Rebecca,
And the party.
And the party. When you have a data that is not exclusive to the data subject that wants to port the data. So what is the right balance between privacy and security and portability when we're talking about this aspect? So how can we, or does Facebook think about, has thought about ways to provide the person that is depicted in the picture and is not the data subject porting the data? Have you think about a way to make this more practical?
Sure. We think there are probably a menu of options you can take advantage of. One could involve sort of a consent mechanism, right? So, and then again, those consent mechanisms can vary. So if I'm about to port an image, and Rebecca's tagged that image, we can do a couple of things. We can remove the tag so that the new service doesn't know that Rebecca's in it. That is the most privacy protective mechanism, right? As a result, the new service, however, doesn't know that Rebecca's in the image and then can't reach out to Rebecca to invite her to use the new service. So that's, that's the least pro-competitive or pro-innovation mechanism, but it is the one that would ensure that they have no idea Rebecca's there. Another option is to invite Rebecca to basically consent, either globally, so provide an opt-in, so she says, all of my friends import all of my images, all images in which I appear to any service, or this smaller group of my friends import my images to any service they choose. I trust those friends as my close friends and family. I know that they'll only import it to services that I think I'm comfortable with. Or they can say, all of my friends, but only a certain category of services. So only services that apply, like cat filters or something like that, but no other services are allowed for portability. So that could be sort of a global opt-in mechanism, with obviously degrees of granularity for each, down to which friends and which services. Another option is to dispense with, or is a technical measure in which the fact that Rebecca's tagged is obscured through sort of cryptography, essentially. So we would apply some mathematical obfuscation to the fact that she's tagged, include that information in the transfer, but it would only become clear to the third service who Rebecca was once Rebecca decided to join that service. So she's made the affirmative choice after hearing about it from me that says, oh, I actually like this face cat app where there are cat filters everywhere. I want to go use that service. Then it would, then the grayed out Rebecca tag or the obfuscated Rebecca tag would suddenly become visible to the third service, and they could say, oh, Rebecca, it turns out your friends have already put you in a bunch of pictures on this service. Wouldn't you like to take advantage of our features or whatever? So, that sort of strikes the balance, right? Rebecca makes the choice as to use the service, but we also transfer information about the social graph in the first instance. So they know, the third service knows that I have friends who might potentially be interested and that they can reach out to once they make the decision to join that service. And they can make the connection as well. And there is value in the connection. I think that's the important thing. The fact that Rebecca and I are connected on Facebook or on another service is valuable. It says something about the interests that we might have in common. It says something about the likely other common friends we might have, our social graph. And that information is valuable when we're building a new service. And so that sort of provides a little bit of a combination of both privacy protection and competition and innovation incentive. And you can do a couple of things, right? You can also do, if you want to be more protective, you can do the obfuscation or the hashing is what we call it, plus do the opt-in consent, or you can provide a just-in-time notification whenever I decide to transfer a photo in which Rebecca appears. You can do a combination of things, and we want to make sure that the combination of things we're doing strikes the right balance between, again, those competition interests and the data protection interests of Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Bijan.
Bijan, we have a question from Christian. He's asking, how does Facebook manage its responsibilities from an eventual case of data leaking from a portability transaction if this transaction was made by request from a specific user?
So that's actually the fifth question in the white paper. Accountability, right?
Yes.
Who is responsible when something goes wrong? We don't want something to go wrong. We all expect, the controllers in an ecosystem, the processors, to be compliant with the data protection law, to be, using the best practices, but often that doesn't happen. And we've had some bad experience with that in the past. And so we want to make sure that the accountability framework in place is extremely clear. If it's not clear, then users won't want to take advantage of the right data portability because they don't know who's going to be responsible if something goes wrong. So they'll be like, well, everyone's going to wash their hands of this. I don't want to make my data move anywhere. That's not something that we want. That's obviously not something that the regulators want. And so I think clarity is important. At the moment, we aren't sure. Probably in the EU, where there are pretty clear dynamics between controllers and processors, and a recipient is a new controller, and the data subject is the controller in the context of making the transfer. We think it's pretty obvious. If something happens badly on the far end. If there's a data leak or a breach, we would try to direct the user probably to the new service, to the recipient service. But I think one thing that's important is that there needs to be alignment between what the actual liability or accountability scheme is and what the expectations of users is, and the expectations of other, civil society, of the press, because if the law says one thing, but users feel like Facebook is a big company, they should be responsible anyway, then there's clearly been a failing on the part of us and on the part of regulators in doing education. And so we think there's a combination between clarity in the law and then clarity in practice. We need to make sure that those things match up. But right now there isn't much clarity in most jurisdictions about any of that, right? So we're hoping that as we have these conversations, we reach a place, perhaps through a code of conduct or certification scheme, in which the accountability framework is much more clear. So in the code of conduct scheme, if you are found to have been compliant with the code of conduct, if Facebook performs the transfer to you, and then you have a data breach, that's solely on you. Facebook exists in a liability shield, for example, because we were relying on the representations you made and then the independent entity that verified your compliance made to us. And in the same way, the user would not come to Facebook because the user was relying on the little sticker or the code of conduct certification schemes, attestation that this recipient was a good actor in the ecosystem. And so we think that the codes of conduct certification scheme should be paired with clear liability structures and potentially liability shields for transferring entities, the ones that are performing the portability transfer, so that they feel comfortable enabling as many companies that are compliant with the law in the ecosystem to enable transfer.
So Bijan, thank you very much for sharing your thought with us, your questions about the lack in our jurisdiction, and thank you for clarifying your doubts as well. And we are almost an hour here, so we're almost to the end of this live, and I want to thank you all for being here today and sharing this moment with us. Thank you, Bijan. Thank you, Rebecca, for being here. Thank you, Facebook. Thank you, Caitlin. And obrigada, pessoal, por nos acompanharem nessa live hoje. A gente está chegando agora quase a 1 hora e por isso vamos terminando a live por aqui. Continuem deixando as suas perguntas, que assim que a gente puder, a gente vai continuando respondendo por comentários com vocês. E nos acompanhem nas redes sociais e terminamos por aqui. Bye-bye.